Everyone, welcome to the latest Near and Rupar. I am Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice, and I'm here as I am every Friday afternoon with David Near, author slash publisher of the Down Ballot. David, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I am so glad that it's finally the weekend. I feel like we say this every week, but especially with the redistricting wars just going completely off the chain, the week has been completely bonkers, and I am super glad for a little break. I hope. How about
Yeah, and I'm doing well too. Oh, you're frozen on your end here. Let's see if you unfreeze. I was just going to compliment David on his Mets cap before he disappeared into the ether. There he is.
oh, phew.
Yeah, I didn't realize you're a Mets fan. That's been they've been slumping a little bit lately, right? I mean, they got Juan Soto. It's looking okay, but playoffs, are they going to make the playoffs? I guess I'm not sure.
I mean, look, I always say, Aaron, that I'm either the world's biggest optimist or the world's biggest pessimist because I'm a Jew, I'm a Democrat, and I'm a Mets fan. And I mean, if you're rooting for all three, that's
Yeah.
boy, I don't know what kind of delusion I'm laboring under, but as a Mets fan, Aaron, I always assume the worst,
Oh
and that way I
yes.
can be pleasantly surprised.
Well, hey, at least you have an owner who is willing to spend some money on players, unlike the owner of my Minnesota Twins. But
Uh,
I know people are not tuning in to listen to us talk baseball, as fun as that would
no, they're
be.
not.
And it is the weekend, which gets me thinking that I am actually going to the Twins game tomorrow, so looking forwud to that.
Oh,
But
nice.
David, you mentioned that for you it's been a crazy week, and you guys had a really impressive piece in the down ballot today. The topic of what we're going to talk about during this live is basically the plan that's kind of emerging from Trump and his Republican enablers to, at the very least, corrupt next year's elections. If not, some might use the term rigged to describe what Republicans are up to there. And you, in the down ballot, tackled one prong of this, which is the gerrymandering effort that's obviously underway in Texas, which we talked about last week. But your piece really honed in on how Democrats can respond, getting really into the weeds of the laws in various states, kind of the political constraints. And one of your takeaways, and I'll let you kind of summarize it, but what I took away from your piece is that the best shot that Dems have to really fight fire with fire on gerrymandering is in California.
Yeah.
Now, it was a little bit hard to see that in your analysis, if I'm remembering it correctly, you concluded that there could be five seats right now that are held by Republicans that could be kind of counter gerrymandered, looking at the broader picture, in considering what Texas is doing in California to benefit Democrats.
Yeah, that's exactly spot on. The issue, though, and this is something that we also get at in this special report that we published, and you can find it if you go to d-downballot.com. It's pinned to the top of the site right now, is that Democrats do face a lot of constraints in almost every blue state, in particular because they've adopted independent redistricting commissions in their state constitutions, and Democrats can't just say, "Oh, we're going to ignore those." They're in the state constitution. They would get smacked down by the courts if they tried. And so Governor Newsom in California, he wants to hold a special election asking California voters to adopt a temporary map that specifically would be triggered by Republican states engaging in this completely inappropriate, out of cycle, mid-decade gerrymandering. So if Texas backs down, California will too. But that really, I think, gets to the point of what we wanted to discuss more broadly on this week's episode, which is Republicans have a lot more opportunities to engage in mid-decade gerrymandering. And that's only one piece of it, because we saw just yesterday Trump talking about wanting to redo the census. And it wasn't clear
Yeah.
whether he wants to try to rig the next census that wouldn't happen until 2030, or if he thinks that he can get away with conducting a mid-decade census, which is beyond unprecedented and poses so many problems. And yeah, these are two of the key ways that, especially the gerrymandering, that they want to try to rig the midterms. But I also have to emphasize, they're trying to rig the midterms because they're worried they're going to lose. If they thought they could just cancel the elections and get away with it, they wouldn't be doing any of this stuff.
Yeah. And we do have a really good question in from Rob here, which I will get to. And that's a reminder that if you want to ask us questions during these lives that we do on Friday. You need to be a paid subscriber either to the Down Ballot or Public Notice. But if you sign up, I believe in real time, as soon as you sign up, you
Yeah.
will be able to send us questions, and we try to get to many of them as we can, which is usually most of them. But so I was wondering with the census thing specifically, the reason that this kind of surprised me that Trump came out with this yesterday is that, at least you can look at the gerrymandering stuff and say this is legal. We may not like it, but, no one is arguing that Republicans in Texas can't do this. Politically they can do it. I don't think there's any real legal constraint in Texas for them to gerrymander. Correct me if you think I'm mistaken there.
I mean, you're right. The only possible restraint is the Voting Rights Act, but that is really teetering on its last legs. And also, I think Republicans are probably going to be smart enough to try to steer away from that, not even raise those questions.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right.
Right. And so the reason I mentioned that is because with the census, it seems like this is pretty clearly taking us down a road now of illegality where, the census is supposed to count everybody who is residing in a state, regardless of your immigration status. The text of the Constitution is very clear on that point. And so, it seems like really kind of like a bank shot for Trump. It doesn't seem something that, this is going to be realistic for them to get a census done in time for the midterms next year. If he's talking about the 2030 census, that's kind of odd because, obviously these states plan for the census years in advance, but, that Trump seems very self-interested. I mean, 2030, presumably he's not going to be the president at that point. So, what does he really care about that? And it seems like the gerrymandering stuff is going pretty well in Texas, at least, right? And for the reasons that you just touched upon, there's a question as to how effectively Democrats can really fight back. So it just seemed kind of odd to me from just like a politics standpoint. You think Trump would kind of leave well enough alone, but then he comes out with this demand, that the Commerce Department start working up a census that would exclude undocumented people. And it just doesn't really seem feasible in the short term. And it seems blatantly illegal in the long term, unless he's talking about 2030, which doesn't make a lot of sense either.
Yeah. So as with Trump, as you know better than anyone, Aaron, he posted this on Truth Social, and of course it was vague and unclear. And also, like, he claimed that he had directed the Commerce Department to, begin doing whatever it is he thinks he wants them to do. But like, who knows if that's really true, right? Like he says so many things that haven't actually happened. Let's say Marjorie Taylor Greene. She has proposed legislation demanding an immediate new census that would exclude people who are unauthorized immigrants. And as you said, Aaron, the language of the Constitution is really clear. Like, often there's so much vagueness in the Constitution, but the census is really explicit about counting the number of persons. It says persons. And like, I saw someone on Twitter say, like, unless you're prepared to say that undocumented immigrants are not persons, then, how are you going to get around that? Now, of course, Republicans might actually believe that in their hearts. I think even for this Supreme Court, that's probably a bridge too far. And so, then there's the other aspect, which is the simple logistics. The census is an unbelievably massive undertaking. This is a huge country, more than 330 million people. And the preparations for the 2030 census are already underway. It's not like they show up in 2029 and they do the census in 2030. You spend most of the decade planning for it. So the idea that they could actually pull this off, I mean, like you said, it just seems absurd.
Yeah.
There's no way they could do it before 2020.
Yeah. Well, I did see on that point, I saw Charlie Kirk, post something that got a lot of traction because I believe it was on his show. He was talking about this with, he alleged that the 2020 census was corrupt, which, kind of raises a whole different set of questions because Trump was president then. It's kind of this eternal question of politics, who was president in 2020. In fact, Trump was. So, if the census was botched, he doesn't want to blame but himself. But so the idea seemed to be flowing from this post, and I've seen other kind of MAGA influencers raise this, would be going back and kind of revising the 2020 census might be one idea of what they're trying to do here based on other sorts of data where they could correct and basically subtract the undocumented population. That takes us pretty far down the road toward just like flagrant illegality, which, when you have this gerrymandering effort going on simultaneously, it seems a little bit unnecessary or like kind of this weird bank shot. But I do want to get to Rob's question before we get too far down the road here, because I know some of your coverage of this issue has touched upon the question that he has here. He says, this gerrymandering BS really only works if Republicans expect to retain all the gains with Hispanic voters that they saw
Yeah.
from Trump last November. I have my doubts, particularly as the economic malaise takes hold. David, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. This is always the trickiest thing when drawing maps. Is the last election a guide to the future, or are you fighting the last war? And we have seen a lot of polling show, of course, showing Americans broadly in general souring on Trump and Latinos in particular. So, can Republicans in Texas and also Florida is now moving forward with plans to engage in mid-decade redistricting? Can Republicans hang on to their gains? It's a huge question. Now, what I will say is there has been a lot of talk, and we've mentioned this on the show before, that could Republicans draw a map, especially in Texas, that backfires on them and makes their members vulnerable? That is almost certainly not going to happen. But what could very well happen is that the seats that they are trying to basically steal from Democrats, the blue seats that they want to flip to red, might not wind up being as red as they hope. In particular, if Latino voters, revert to voting more like the patterns they engaged in 2020. So, yeah, Republicans are talking a big game about flipping 5 seats in Texas, but if you have a year like 2018, for instance, when Beto O'Rourke almost knocked off Ted Cruz, Republicans might only flip 1 or even 0 of those targeted seats.
Yeah, that's a point worth emphasizing there. And oh, let's see. Oh, there was okay. Rob also added that this was Chris Kobach's big thing, and SCOTUS basically said there had to be a decent reason for adding a citizenship question, which is true that Trump tried this in his first
Right.
term and was shot down by the Supreme Court. But I remember that Supreme Court decision kind of left the door open on the citizenship question, where it said that the particular version that Trump was trying to put into the census was not, was not permissible, but it left it open if they came up with a different formulation for putting the question on there for possibly doing that down the line.
Yeah, basically, that was one of those Trump 1.0 era cases where John Roberts was basically saying, lie to me more cleverly. You know,
Yeah.
he wants to go along with their shit, but, they need to satisfy him in exactly the right way. I think reading between the lines here, Aaron, this idea of correcting the last census, I think that these maniacs, their idea is, well, we have this census data and we know that it's corrupt, even though it was carried out under Donald Trump when he was president. And so we'll use AI to
Yeah.
determine who actually shouldn't have been counted, and we'll readjust the numbers. And then with those adjusted numbers, states can then redistrict based on that. Now, the Supreme Court, though, has also been extremely clear that only actual census numbers from the decennial census can be used for redistricting. The Census Bureau produces updated estimates every single year on population shifts between decades, between censuses, but you're not allowed to use those because they are not actual censuses. You can't use those for redistricting. You can use those for anything else, but not drawing the lines. So, it really does feel like a massive bank shot with so many moving pieces, so many logistical hurdles, and even with this far right Supreme Court, so many legal hurdles. It really does feel like a lot of bluster. But Aaron, I wanted to ask you, one of your writers, Lisa Needham, had an excellent piece on this topic about the meaning of all of this the other day. And her conclusion is that Trump and the Republicans are pushing all this because they're scared.
Yeah, well, certainly you can look at Trump's approval, which is now, I believe, in the high 30s in some polls, which is pretty dire. He still seems like he's within the contours of the approval that he had in his first term, but it's, we're plumbing kind of depths with that. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is that we really haven't had the experience of Trump being president during a recession or, with kind of like an economic malaise. Like, obviously, these numbers that Trump was furious about last week, it showed anemic job growth, but it did not show negative job growth. So we're still not really in kind of recession territory at this point. But it seems like kind of the cross currents in the economy are pushing us that way. And there's a reason that Trump is kind of freaking out with demanding that Jerome Powell cut rates, and it's not because he thinks that the economy is booming, even though he says that. It's because he thinks that there's some weakness there that maybe even if there are long-term effects with inflation, that cutting rates could kind of juice. So, when you combine those dynamics that the economy is not in a great place with this legislation that Republicans just passed last month and Trump signed into law that has even worse numbers than Trump does, then obviously there's a lot of negative effects, especially starting in 2027 with the Medicaid cuts. that don't, that will certainly be a big campaign issue next year. And that will be a tough one for Republicans to deal with. Like, yeah, I mean, all the ingredients are kind of there for, it to be a really negative cycle for Republicans next year. So there's obviously, a lot of reasons for that. There's reasons that suddenly there's this kind of frenzy of redistricting and this talk of the census. Now, if you think about it from the other standpoint, like would Trump be doing this even if his numbers looked a little bit better? Maybe, I mean, maybe this is just part of kind of the Trump experience that he gains power and then he has, he can't help but try to entrench that power and kind of play dirty to do it. But, I certainly think the fact that both his numbers are sagging and, Republicans who are also trailing on the generic ballot right now have bad numbers. I think there's a lot of incentives, obviously, for them to try to corrupt the election.
There was a really good question from Wendy earlier asking, could Texas lose seats if undocumented Americans are undocumented folks living in America are removed from the census? And that's a fantastic question because when we talk about the census numbers, we mostly think of redistricting, redrawing the lines so that every district has equal population. But there's the other big piece of this, which is reapportionment. And, of course, that these are arcane topics, but they really, really matter. And reapportionment is what happens every 10 years when, based on population growth or population decline sometimes in states, the number of seats in the House that each state is awarded can change. And so Texas, which has had massive growth in recent decades, keeps adding seats every 10 years. And a lot of these Rust Belt states keep losing seats in reapportionment. There have been analyses that suggest that if you were to remove undocumented immigrants from the census tallies, that Texas could definitely lose seats. We know that there is a large population of undocumented immigrants in Texas.
Mhm.
So that would really be, I mean, talk about getting hoisted by your own petard. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine if they somehow were to ram through some new census or rejigger the old census and then Texas loses seats. I mean, I think they'd
Mhm.
be beyond furious about that.
Yeah.
That I think more than anything else, maybe is the ultimate practical obstacle to this. No red state wants to even dream of losing a single seat.
Yeah, I believe those analyses showed that there was more inflow, including of undocumented people into red states. But I still wonder if California would just have like a higher number overall, and so still more to lose than Texas would. But again, because there hasn't been a citizenship question on the census, like we're
Right.
kind of guessing on that. I mean, there have been some analyses, but they're kind of on data that isn't necessarily the strongest or the most clear. So, but that is interesting that there could be a dynamic of some blowback, at least for individual red states, even if net they still gain with the national map.
Yeah, and you're right about California would be undermined too. But you're right. It's very unpredictable because like would New York gain back seats?
Yeah. What
Again, I mean, who knows?
And I did want to ask you kind of a New York specific question
Sure.
because, I've noticed just kind of in my own world of, being in touch with comms people and clipping a lot of events that there seems to be kind of like, there seems to be a moment right now for Kathy Hochul where, she's been very strong on the redistricting with some colorful quotes. And, she even, which kind of surprised me, she did a press conference, I believe on Monday, where
Wait,
she endorsed getting rid of the independent redistricting commission, at least temporarily. And, she had a quote that was basically like, I'm sick of fighting with one hand tied behind my back. We need to fight fire with fire sort of thing. But, as part of the reporting that you have done, I mean, you have detailed the reasons why, New York, it's not super feasible that they're going to be able to fight fire with fire and redistrict New York. So that gets me wondering if she's kind of creating a little bit of a political problem for herself in that, she's saying all the right things, but she can't really do them. And so, I could see this being, there being a way that this turns out where Texas is able to gerrymander and New York can't. And then she ends up looking, like it was a promise made, not kept sort of situation. What do you think about that?
she's been so explicit though about her hands being tied
Yeah.
that I don't really think anyone can blame her. And also, the person most responsible for creating New York's redistricting commission, which is a very crappy commission stocked with politicians. It's not at all like California's very independent commission or Arizona's or Michigan's. The person responsible for that is Andrew Cuomo.
Yes.
And she
Yeah.
obviously hates Andrew Cuomo. And she hasn't publicly pointed the finger at him, but she certainly always could. Yeah, in New York, it's much, much harder to change the Constitution. The legislature has to pass a new amendment not once but twice, and there has to be an election in between the times that the legislature passes an amendment, and then voters have to weigh in on the amendment. There is I think it's kind of a bank shot, frankly, but there is one possibility that, and Hochul alluded to this. She talked about pursuing a litigation strategy, which basically means suing to try to get the current map struck down, the very map that she signed into law last year. I think there's possible infirmities in the map. It does feel like a difficult thing to do. But also, it's important for Democrats to be thinking about this stuff, even if they can't get it done by 2026, because Republicans have always played the long game. And this is something that folks on the left have just not been very willing to do. Many of them, especially many elected Democratic politicians, is just because something can't happen in the next year or two doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing.
Yeah. And speaking of long game versus short game, I mean, right now, one of the big stories, which has kind of been a evolving one as we talk, are the Texas
Yeah.
Democrats who are in Illinois, some are in New York, although I think they've been kind of laying a little bit low, obviously, since John Cornyn requested Kash Patel get the FBI involved in trying to arrest these legislators. I guess I never, correct me if you saw something that I didn't, but I don't think I saw Patel necessarily affirmatively
No.
respond to that. So that, it's kind of unclear whether Cornyn, will be satisfied with the request that he made. But I'm kind of curious just in my own mind because I haven't totally thought through all the different, all the different permutations in terms of how this could play out. And then it seems like there's a little bit of conflicting information about, how long the special session could last. But I guess my question is there an end game for Texas Democrats here? Beyond sort of the obvious that at some point they're going to have to go back there. And, then once there's a quorum, Republicans will be able to impose these maps because they have the votes to do it. But, is there any end game in terms of like the timeline of the special session where they could at least kind of string this out, in a way that would really be damaging to Abbott and Republicans there? Or are they just kind of playing the political game, trying to win a messaging battle at this point?
So the answer is definitely both. And just to back up, we alluded to this on last week's episode, where we talked about the possibility of a walkout, and then 2 days later on Sunday, it actually happened. And I really wasn't sure it was going to happen. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And just to remind folks, Texas is very unusual in that it has a very high quorum requirement. 2/3 of all lawmakers have to be present in order for the legislature to do business. There's only 3 other states in the nation that have a requirement like that. In most states, you just need a simple majority. And so even though Texas Democrats are in the minority, by denying the quorum, which takes 2/3, they can prevent the legislature from passing this new gerrymander. And so that's why Democrats left the state. And they went to a few different states. I think they've mostly now congregated in Illinois and the Chicago suburbs. And so you're asking, what's the end game here? They can't leave Texas indefinitely. All of these people have other jobs. They have lives at home. This is expensive and difficult and disruptive to stay away from home. And the reason why they have to leave Texas is because if they're in the state, then Texas law enforcement can compel them to come back to the legislature. And this is why John Cornyn is begging the FBI to track these Democrats down, because Texas law enforcement can't just walk into Illinois and start arresting people, but neither can the FBI, because they haven't been accused of any crimes. There's no, at least not in any credible way. And you're right that multiple FBI offices declined to comment. The DOJ declined to comment. So it seems like a bunch of nonsense. But let's talk about the end game. There is a possibility that, and I think it's, look, I don't want to get people's hopes up, but there is a possibility that Democrats could really disrupt what Republicans are doing, because the current special session in the Texas legislature lasts a maximum of 30 days. And we're more than halfway through it now. The problem is that Governor Greg Abbott can call a new special session the moment the current one ends. But there's a huge practical consideration, which is that there are primaries next year, and Texas has one of the earliest primaries in the nation in early March. And there's a candidate filing deadline of December 8th. But more than that, candidate filing opens a month earlier than that, in early November. And if you petition your way on the ballot, you have to know what your district lines are, because you have to get voters in your district to sign your petitions so that you can actually appear on the primary ballot. So there's only so long that you can delay things for. Look, I don't know if Democrats can hold out for 3 months. That would be a really long amount of time. But the longer they hold out, the harder as a practical matter it becomes because you got to get the election cycle started.
Hmm. And do you have the sense, because I saw some people making this point this week, and I don't know if I totally agreed with it, that some people are kind of reading the situation in Texas as this spinning out of Republicans' control a little bit. When you see the flop sweat of these guys on Fox calling for arrests and really kind of turning the hyperbole up to 11. I can't. For me, that kind of just reads as like normal Republican grandstanding on Fox. But I think there's a way that some people are kind of reading this where it seems like the events have kind of spiraled out of control for Greg Abbott and Paxton and the rest of them down there.
They Republicans still hold the best cards because, like I said, they can keep calling new special sessions, and as you know, if the quorum, if the walkout breaks, then they will be able to pass some sort of new map. But a lot of the shit they're trying to pull now is just completely ridiculous, like the Cornyn stuff we just mentioned, but also Greg Abbott filed a suit before the Texas Supreme Court asking it to declare the seat held by Gene Wu, who is the House Democratic Caucus leader, asking and to say that he had abandoned his seat and that his seat should therefore be declared, and there should be a special election for that seat. His legal arguments are such crap, Aaron. I mean, it's astonishing how bad his brief was. But what's really funny is that at the very end of his brief, which he filed a few days ago, he said he respectfully requests the Texas Supreme Court to act on this by Thursday at 5 p.m. Well, guess what? The Texas Supreme Court, which is full of just partisan GOP acts, didn't do shit yesterday. So all of these attempts by Republicans, whether it's sending the FBI or sending the courts after Democrats, none of that has worked yet. And also, Aaron, we had a Texas state representative, Mihaela Plisa, on our other podcast, the Down Ballot podcast this week, and she has said the reception they have gotten everywhere they've gone has been amazing. They're just getting massive amounts of support. And like, that's the kind of like love, honestly, that you need to be able to sustain this kind of walkout. And you're right, Republicans, they're just flops what is disgusting.
Yeah. And with Cornyn, I mean, and let me know if this is your read of it too. It seems like obviously he's now kind of fighting for his political survival in the primary against Paxton, who's running against him in the primary. Is the effort to get the FBI involved here and kind of make this appeal to Kash Patel? I mean, do you read that as kind of a political, sort of a desperate political act to shore up the MAGA base of the party because he's kind of viewed as being a squish and not totally authentic? So kind of generate a headline that maybe seem helpful for him, even if there isn't any follow up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Cornyn is trailing badly in all of the polls to Ken Paxton. He even floated the idea of dropping out and then walked that back a little while ago. So yeah, I think he's just trying to look like the big tough guy. But Paxton is drawing way more headlines. But what's also funny, Aaron, is that that suit that Greg Abbott filed to try to expel the House Democratic leader. He is not actually entitled to file that kind of lawsuit. And Ken Paxton sent a letter to the Supreme Court, and it was so condescending, saying like, "We appreciate the governor's enthusiasm, but actually, it's the attorney general who has to file this kind of lawsuit." So I don't want to say that there's cracks appearing in the GOP facade, but I thought it was pretty funny that Ken Paxton publicly had to, pat Greg Abbott on the head there.
Yeah. Well, and with the Paxton thing, I mean, it almost seems like Republicans are kind of running an experiment to see how loathsome a candidate can be, in a statewide and still win. Because we don't even have time to get into all the baggage that Paxton has. But what are the perceptions? From you said you mentioned a Texas Democrat on your show this week, and I'm sure you talked to other people there too. Like, is Paxton actually seen as being beatable? In the statewide next year, if he ends up being the candidate. I mean, I've seen a little bit. Maybe you've covered. I'm sure you have. Where Wesley Hunt, who's a House member, there's been some talk of him, getting into the primary to compete against Paxton, and the case that he has alluded to, is that Paxton's unelectable. So, what's kind of the state of play there? Because it seems like for me from the outside that Paxton would be beatable, but again, Republicans always seem to pull these races out in Texas.
It's not wishful thinking on the part of Democrats. And here's how we know. The National Republican Senatorial Committee, the NRSC, which is the official campaign arm of the Senate GOP that's dedicated to electing Republicans to the Senate, one of their top operatives told donors, warned donors not to give money to Paxton. They said only donate to Cornyn. So if the GOP's most important money arm is worried about Ken Paxton, that is a real tell. Now, groups like the NRSC, these official campaign arms, they always have to support incumbents, but this was definitely unusual, and this wound up being reported. The news got out there. I think they wanted the news to get out there about this. So it's not just Democrats hoping to be able to face Paxton in next year's Senate race. It's that Republicans are definitely worried about it as well. In terms of the GOP race to the bottom, how disgusting of a candidate can they elect and have them win statewide? I mean, look, they've nominated people like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania or Mark Robinson in North Carolina. They're not averse at all to nominating the most disgusting assholes in the world. So yeah, I think in my mind, there's no question Paxton is the favorite right now, and Texas would be a really top tier Senate race if he emerges as the GOP nominee.
And that could even, in theory, create some problems with the redistricting push where. And we talked a little bit about this last week where, it's not like a foregone conclusion that Republicans would win each and every one of those seats, even if they are skewed.
Right.
If Paxton, in terms of being at the top of the ticket, is really not a very viable candidate and Dems can find, a good candidate to run against him. And what's the latest there? Has there been, what's the Democratic field looking like shaping up against Paxton?
So you have a couple of candidates running. Former Congressman Colin Allred, who ran last cycle and lost to John Cornyn. There is also a former astronaut running, and darn it, his name escapes me right now. But there is a very prominent candidate who looks likely to join as well, and that's State Representative James Tallarico. And he has been one of the most prominent, maybe the most prominent members of the State House quorum breakers. I saw that he's done, since they left, 48 different interviews. That number's probably higher right now. He has a great media presence. And he went on Joe Rogan recently, and Rogan
I saw that. Yes.
said, that he thought he could be president of the United States someday. I'm not sold on Joe Rogan being kingmaker in Democratic primaries, but at least Larry, I got to respect him for having the guts to go on Rogan. So it's an interesting field, and even if Paxton somehow is the nominee, I think Dems are going to try to compete there. Aaron, I know we have to wrap up soon, but I wanted to close the loop on something you brought up last week, which was you mentioned last Friday morning that in Virginia, this is a total change. We're going to 2025 elections, leaving Texas behind. But in Virginia, the GOP candidate for governor, and that race is this fall, Winsome Earl-Sears, she went on CNN and had this total meltdown. And I went and watched all your clips that you gathered, and it was freaky bizarre. Like, she just kept talking like an auctioneer to try to prevent the CNN reporter, Manu Raju, from even asking her a question. It was completely freaky. And Democrat Abigail Spanberger, she's the Democratic nominee, she released her first negative ad this week. And it features clips, the exact same clips. So it's like it's almost like you were feeding the Spanberger campaign the best clips from her Winsome Earl-Sears' meltdown.
Oh yeah, no, and I'm grateful that so many people who work on campaigns and staffers pay attention to myself or ASIN or other people who are doing clipping. I've noticed the Bulwark has really gotten into the clipping game in earnest now. It seems like from their main account, I've got my eye on them as a competitor because they're getting pretty quick with it. But yeah, and that's interesting because. I guess if Earl-Sears is going to win in a statewide, I understand the logic of going on CNN, but it just backfired so spectacularly because I do think MAGA, they like when you go on the liberal show and kind of like Tim Burchett, who goes on CNN a lot, and he'll do kind of a performative meltdown, but he'll start kind of talking over the anchor, and I guess I can kind of squint and see how Trumpers might think that that's appealing, but with her, it just didn't. I don't know. There was something wrong with it. I guess I can't quite put it into words, but she came off looking, like she was kind of out of control, and she was being asked very direct questions about, like, would you support additional abortion restrictions? And she danced around that. And there were a couple other as well where the questions were not even gotcha. They were just kind of like asking her to detail her own positions. And she kind of flew off the handle, just came off as very defensive. And so I guess that's the perils, if you're a Republican, of going on CNN, which these days isn't exactly known for doing super combative interviews. There's no Jim Acosta there anymore. But
Right.
even Manu Raju, who is, very kind of down the middle, he's a very good reporter, but he's not, a polemicist or someone who's going to ask a bunch of gotchas. And even that, was enough to trigger kind of a self-immolation.
Well, I think for our listeners on Near and Rupar who happen to miss these clips, Aaron, maybe you have a good hook to re-up some of them after we sign off, given the Spanberger ad, because they really are worth seeing. It was a freakish sort of meltdown. Not You're right, different from your typical
Yeah.
performative
Well,
GOP meltdown.
and just kind of, to wrap things up, I mean, in terms of, it's always nice to kind of end not with doom and gloom, but some reasons for hope. And, the Virginia race, and I believe, the races in New Jersey are shaping up to be pretty positive for Dems too. And if you reflect back on 2021, especially the result in Virginia was kind of the first real indication that,
Yeah.
MAGA, Youngkin wasn't really MAGA in that race. And I remember he kind of tried to play both ways where, he would denounce January 6th, but kind of leave the door open to supporting Trump if he ran again, sort of thing. Which I think was enough where Trump doesn't seem to be very thrilled about him. Trump's always kind of kept him at arm's length. But so those races in 2021, I think, kind of fueled a narrative of rising Republican strength. If Dems have a good showing both in Virginia and in New Jersey, it's worth considering that that'll be another ingredient this fall. In addition to Congress being back and there being some difficult situations for Republicans to navigate with keeping the government open and things like that. That these elections that are coming up, most imminently here on the horizon are shaping up good for Dems too.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia's not a perfect bellwether. Nothing is. But look back at 2017, Ralph Northam won the governorship there in a landslide, I think by 9 points. And that definitely heralded a massive year for Democrats in 2018. Also in 2009, Republicans won the governorship there. Obama had just won this massive victory. And then Republicans kicked Democratic asses. And to me, that really was a warning sign of the 2010 election, which of course was a huge, huge disaster for Democrats. So absolutely worth paying close attention to. And right now, Republicans are the body language from Republicans about Virginia. It ain't good.
Yes. Yeah. Where I believe he was asked directly about Earl
Oh,
Sears, and
right.
he did not exactly give a strong endorsement. It was kind of like she's going to have to run really, really hard to win or something like that. It certainly was not what you would expect from Trump. Who, I think, Trump does have a certain political instinct, and I think he kind of smells a loser there and doesn't want to be sullied by associating himself with her.
Well, thank you to Tom Shaw for being a hero of today's
There we go.
Q&A. Posted a link to Spanberger's ad. Definitely give it a watch. It'll give you a flavor for the ridiculous moment that Aaron captured.
Yeah, and with that, it's a good note to wrap it up on today. So thank you to the over 800 people who are with us today for Near and Rupar. Obviously, I think this has been a really good, this episode, sort of endorsement of David's work, because obviously the great stuff that you're doing on gerrymandering, I highly recommend people check out the piece that he ran today, going state by state on the Democratic side and going through kind of the upsides and downsides and constraints that are relevant with each of those states as Democrats consider how to fight back against GOP gerrymandering. We will be back next Friday, back to our normal time of 2 p.m. And, I feel like it's been a little bit of obviously there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the news, but we've been in kind of this holding pattern of obviously the gerrymandering stuff. There's the Epstein stuff, but with Congress not being around right now, it feels a little bit quiet in kind of an unsettling way. So, maybe I shouldn't say too much more because I want to end it on a positive note. I don't want to start getting anxious again, but we'll see what the week brings. We'll be back with you next week at 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you for tuning in. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.
Have a great weekend, everybody.